Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukraine war. We start out in the northern direction of Sinkivka, where we here see that the Russians have regained a foothold within the village after they previously had a foothold and then withdrew from it to then launch an attack here on the flank, where they managed to push the Ukrainians back to the central parts of the village by the intersection east of the village to get supplies in and out of the village. They then restarted offensive operations and regained this foothold within the village, which raises the question, why were they forced to push out and why were they attacking the flank instead of going back in at the very start? Some of the answers were answered by the reports coming from Sinkivka that the fighting had significantly intensified to a much higher level. This likely means that the Ukrainians sent reinforcements to push the Russians out, and following that, the Russians then attacked the flank to try and hit the supply route of the Ukrainians, or simply to strengthen their flanks to prevent a counterattack by the Ukrainians of cutting them off. And with this, the Russians succeeded with capturing the flank, and with that, they restarted their offensive operations into Sinkivka, where they'll likely continue fighting the Ukrainian reinforcements there. With these developments, we see that the Russians are intensifying their offensive operations by Sinkivka and will likely send their own reinforcements, as the Battle of Sinkivka is a very important one for both sides, as it leads into the next defensive position, which is Petropavlivka, and that is the final one before the Russians reach Kupiansk here to the south. The Sinkivka is the operating point. Due to the small size of the village, it is reminiscent of Robotyne in the sense that if the Russians enter it, there will be a lot of artillery by the Ukrainians to hit their positions. However, as the Ukrainians run lower on artillery shells, the effectiveness of the village will also decrease. This is why the Ukrainians are largely replacing the artillery shells by FPV drones, which they are producing at a much faster rate. We then move on to the next section, where we see here in the direction of Terny to the east, the Ukrainians have geolocated this position right here, where the Russians were hit by an FPV drone. So we're seeing that there's still positional fighting here in the direction of Terny, which explains why there has been no advances by either side. The fighting is very positional due to the proximity to Terny. If the Russians were to advance any further, they would be storming the village itself. So they're still preparing for that point by attacking here in the northern section, expanding that as well, and getting a bit closer in the central parts before storming the village from both the north and the south. But I believe that the Russians are waiting for one time where they'll launch attacks simultaneously across the front to ensure that the Ukrainians will have a difficult time responding, and that is when we will see offensive operations in the direction of Terny. Until then, the positional fighting, allowing them to get close to these villages if Terny and Yapolivka will continue. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of the west of Avdiivka, the Russians managed to capture the majority of Tonenka by launching a flanking maneuver here from the north, allowing them to cut off the Ukrainian positions within the village itself and forcing them to be withdrawing from the area. And with this development, we see that the Russians have captured the majority of the village, and there is this geolocated footage showing Russian soldiers being hit by FPV drones of the Ukrainian armed forces. Yet again, the majority of the artillery is being replaced by FPV drones whenever the Ukrainians detect smaller groups of infantry. And at the same time, when it's larger groups or armored vehicles, the Ukrainians launch artillery, or if it's an ambush, they launch artillery. So it is very much a system where they only use it when it is absolutely necessary to inflict the maximum amount of damage, because in the end, artillery is much more firepower than the FPV drones have. But if FPV drones are very effective against individual targets. Now we see that the fighting is taking place here now in the Dacia area and the final parts of Tonenka, and this is an area that is very difficult to defend with the Russian advances here to the north and east of it. And with this, it is likely that the Russians will push towards it, either directly from the northern direction or just pushing through it here from the southern direction. Either way, the Russians are in a position now where Tonenka will likely be captured within the next small period of time, except if the Russians are using this as an artillery zone where they'll simply bombard the Ukrainian positions as long as they send reinforcements. That is the sort of situation that is in Orlivka. The western parts of Orlivka is still in the gray zone. The main reason for that, despite this geolocated footage showing Russian positions in the central parts of Orlivka, is that the Ukrainians sent reinforcements to try and counterattack here in the direction of Orlivka. The same with Tonenka and Berdishi. The Russians have decided to step back and backpedal to the defensive positions, and this is to inflict the maximum amount of damage possible to the Ukrainian forces counterattacking. This is to gain an advantage in the future by grinding down the Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line and essentially using it as a meat grinder for the Ukrainians, continuously building up their forces and counterattacking to regain some of these positions. The Ukrainians so far have had 3 separate counterattacks where they regained some territory. One was in Tonenka, which has now been negated with this Russian operation. In the north, there is these 2 in the direction of Berdishi, where in every single one of them they lose an Abrams tanks. In the case of Deep State Map, they actually report something interesting. They report that throughout these weeks, the Russians are the ones who are constantly attacking. They're claiming that the Russians are launching operations here towards the flank of Tonenka, directly towards it from the north and from the south. All of these operations to capture the village and reach the Ukrainian defensive positions here to the north of the position. At the same time, they report attacks towards Semenivka from the Orlivka and the flanks of Berdishi from Stepove. So with these reports, it is clear that the Deep State Map are reporting that the Russians are the ones on the offensive and the Ukrainians on the defensive, yet we still see that the Ukrainians recaptured some areas and moved all the way to the eastern parts of Berdishi, so there are some incoherent facts here. So we have to go with what there is evidence of, and the evidence points towards the Ukrainians launching counterattacks and the Russians sending reinforcements to hold their positions, which is mainly infantry based, and these are constantly ambushed by the Ukrainians, especially here in the direction of Berdishi, where in Orlivka and Tonenka they have a much greater control over their areas, which makes it more difficult for the Ukrainians to ambush. It is likely due to the fact that the Ukrainians launched their counterattack in Berdishi with strengths, with the 47th Mechanized Brigade launching armored assaults with both Bradleys and Abrams, where they have so far lost a lot of those, but they also managed to successfully ambush multiple parts and multiple scores of the Russian units with heavy artillery and FPV drones. This is why we're seeing that the Ukrainians have recaptured territory in Berdishi, while they are not so successful in Orlivka and Tonenka, because the power that they're exerting here in the north is simply on a whole nother level than what we're seeing in the direction of Orlivka and Tonenka. But also due to the fact that the Russians have much more units here in Orlivka and Tonenka, where Berdishi, their foothold is very small, and it's very difficult for them to send reinforcements and to solidify their positions and dig in. The Ukrainians are able to take advantage of that to push them out. To understand that the Ukrainians have counterattacked from the very start, the Ukrainians entered the village of Berdishi, and in the sense of defense, the Russians have some ATGM positions here by the forest lines. That is their only line of defense within Berdishi, and then they have infantry positions within the houses in the village. So with that, if the Ukrainians launch infantry-based assaults, they have some infantry in the houses, and if they launch an armored-based assault, there is some ATGM defending. But whenever they shoot a ATGM shell, the Ukrainians will detect them with their drones and launch FPV drones or artillery strikes towards those positions, correcting the fire. And with that, it is very dangerous for them to be operating close to the front, so they're likely pushed back here to the forest lines or positions here southeast and completely east of Berdishi. This would leave only the infantry being the first defensive and only defensive line in Berdishi, and they're constantly being ambushed by the Ukrainian Bradleys and Abrams, which makes it very difficult for the Russians to build up their forces. So unless the Russians launch their own offensive operation with their own armored vehicles and so on, it is difficult for them to actually gain more ground in Berdishi, and this is why we can debunk the facts that Deep State Map is reporting that the Russians are launching assaults. Instead, they're simply reinforcing their defenses, which is their first and only line of defense within the village. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.